There we go. So now everyone we're recording. Keep that in mind also if you ask a question that it will be on the recording, but you know, it's available to like-minded people. So that is also the website is also where we can find upcoming monthly themes and the weekly guests. So please share this widely with your networks. And if you have a topic that you'd like to hear about, then let us know that, and we can do our best to cover that topic. Now, before I introduce our special guests, I'd just like to acknowledge where I'm coming from. Excuse me, I'm getting parched. I coming from High River, Alberta, the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the First Peoples of Southern Alberta, including the Siksika, the Piikani, Kiani, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And as I said before, our guest today is David Grieg. David is a registered horticultural therapist in Canada and the US, a certified organic urban land care professional, a certified soil steward and master composter, as well as having a master in education, a professional teaching certificate, and an adult education diploma. David retired from 20 years of instructing from the Camosun College in 2016, where he began a gardening and nursery program for adult learners who did not fit within the traditional college educational system, to prepare them for entry-level employment into the horticultural and nursery industries. So cool. Along with a colleague, he developed and implemented the program in 1996, and it's still running today, which is awesome. Since retiring from teaching, he has created a small business called From Heaven to Earth, where he does garden consultations about soil and landscapes, grows and sells organic heirloom tomato starts with over 90 varieties this year, dahlia tubers, and vermicasting. Sorry. He has been worm farming for over 30 years and currently has 27 worm bins. I thought 6 was lots, which all come from his original worm stock that he brought down on top of their van from the Yukon in 1994, leaving his canoe behind to do so. That must have been a tough decision, I would think, David. But anyway, all this is done in the regular sized residential lot, which is about 100 by 40 feet in Victoria, BC. And in addition to all that, as a volunteer, he runs the composting area at the Abkhazi Gardens. You have to correct me if I said that wrong, and has been doing so for 6 years. So without further ado, I'll throw it over to you, David. Maybe you can let us know where you're joining us from, so I don't mispronounce any words there. But over to you. Thank you again for joining us.
Wow, I don't know who that person was that you introduced, but I'd like to meet him.
Yeah, me too. Luckily,
I'd also like to apologize to everybody that I was trying to do a PowerPoint, but technology got away from me. Nick and his partner were helping, so I apologize for being late.
Sometimes it's all we can do. No, it's awesome.
Yeah. My name is David Grieg, and I live in Victoria, BC, on the traditional unceded territories of the Songhees and Waskamat people of the Coast and Strait Salish people. And my family and I have been visitors here since 1994. So Haitchkit Siam, which is their greeting to say thank you very much, all my friends. Yeah, I'm happy to be here to tell you a little bit about composting, and also look forward to the questions that you have. I saw that there was one person from Esquimalt, so hello, Megan, another person who lives in the Victoria region. I guess the topic was going to be, or is, on composting in small spaces. Now, my small space is a residential lot, so I'm coming from a place of privilege. I don't live in a condo and I don't live in an apartment. I live on a piece of land, a small piece of land. So what I was trying to think about is how I could talk about composting or rendering down organic material wherever you lived. And I know that there's an initiative in Vancouver to get condo owners apartment owners to be composting, and that means utilizing whatever place they have uh, available. And usually that's under the sink, or it could be on a deck, or it could be any place like that. So uh, part of what I'll talk about is what you could possibly do in your apartment or condo, and what you can also be doing outside. So the first one is obviously you could do worms. You could be worm composting because they're in containers. And unlike a dog, you don't have to go out in the morning and you don't have to go out in the evening. They take care of themselves. Unlike or cats, you don't have to pick up their poop. For worms, you want them to poop because then you can use their vermicast. So it's a win-win situation. And all you need is a container, which is you can do a home built and put in some coconut fiber. Or I've just heard about a new product and it's in the States and I haven't seen it here yet. It's called pit moss. And what it is, it's a paper product that has been rendered down, and it's almost like a peat moss, but they call it pit moss from what I've heard. And I saw a person from Florida, and maybe they're familiar with it. I've just heard about it. I haven't seen it in the stores or heard other than that. So you can do that with worms. You can also, which is really an interesting one, use a Rubbermaid container, a fairly large one, and treat it as a compost bin where you're adding organic material to your newspaper or cardboard, but you're doing it like a compost bin. The same as an outdoor compost bin. You don't want to get them too wet. You don't want them to be too dry. You don't want to overfeed them, because then you could have some problems with fruit flies or smells or things of that sort. So that's another option. Now, if you had a big Rubbermaid container, it wouldn't fit under your sink, but you could have a smaller container that you could use. People also use buckets. I've read about it, but I've never used 5-gallon pails for composting, but it is possible. People use wooden containers like wine boxes. You'd have to drink a lot of wine to get a wine box. So unless you could go to a winery and borrow one or whatever, that's another option. There's also the bokashi method, which is using activated EM and utilizing it with wheat bran. There's a number of parts to it, and I know that next presentation will be by Christina Nikolic from the Gardener's Pantry, and she will talk about EM and perhaps bokashi, but it is another alternative to do it. And it's all the methods I've talked about up to now are aerobic. It's with oxygen, because a compost needs oxygen, and it's not the compost, it's the microorganisms that are breaking down the material. And if it's inside a house, it could be worms, it could be the bacteria, it could be the fungi, it could be the actobacteria or the actosmycetes. It's the microorganisms. Whereas the bokashi is still using microorganisms, but they're living without air. It's a very different process. It's a Japanese form of composting. So these are some ways of being able to do it in small spaces. And some of the considerations you need to have are like what you do with the finished product. If you live in an apartment, you don't have planters outside and you're producing material, what are you going to do with it? So it might mean sharing with your neighbors. It might mean sharing with a garden. There's any one of a number of ways to do it. If you had a little deck, you could be incorporating it into your plants. The other part is with that, where is it located? Like I've seen worm bins in living rooms, but it happened to be a fella, built a beautiful sitting area, but the worm bins were under the seat. So it's both a great talking point, uh, especially on those long, cold winter evenings when you have nothing else to talk about. You can open up, say, these are my friends, or it's a way that it's not inconveniencing you in a main traffic area. It's not big that it's going to be impeding another part of your house. So it's another consideration, and that's true of any kind of composting facility or composting. Is it in the way? Is it accessible? Can you get to it? Can you harvest it? Which brings up a whole other part. How do you harvest these things in a small space? So one of the things I do is grow dahlias. And in the springtime, what we do is we pot up dahlia tubers at this point. I've been to some townhouse owners, they have no room in their house. Their dahlia tubers are all over the kitchen table, everywhere. There's no room because they're waiting to get it outside. So it's just things to think about, what to do with your material, and also where you're going to locate it. The other part is do your landlords or strata group, do they appreciate you composting? Like, you got to check that out just to see. And because sometimes I know in some stratas, they don't like anything dirty, and compost isn't dirty, but there's a perception that it can be. And if it goes bad, it can be pretty stinky. Hydrogen sulfide ammonia smell is a very unpleasant smell. It's just one of the problems that goes with it. So I'm teasing to some extent, but these are things to think about as you're going along, and hopefully considering. Yeah, I'm just looking at some notes here, and what I thought I'd do. And when do you want me to finish this, Nick? This introduction.
Just whatever it flows. Just, yep, it's been great so far. So
okay, because we may be here for days. So thanks very much for that offer. What I'm going to do is turn around my screen, and I just want to show you some compost bins on where we live, and it's not mine, it's my partner and I.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just walking over here, and I wanted to just show you these. These containers are worm bins. They're all home built, basically Rubbermaid containers. They've got coconut fiber, newspaper, cardboard in them. All our food scraps go into these bins. They're not huge.
Do you want me to listen to this on my?
Yeah, they're not huge. They do get heavy. So again, you have to be aware that there is going to be some work with these. The other part is, I've had customers that the effluent that can come out of the bottom can stain. So you wouldn't want it to have it on a nice deck. Now, they're off to the side. Our little lot, these are all the worm bins as we go along here. This is not an area that we use, so it's a convenient place to have the worm bins. I have some inside, but they're breeder bins. And got some cardboard. This is my material. They're hiding down below. Of course, they're all being shy right now. Nobody likes to be seen. Okay, so there we go. There are worms in there. Believe you me. Here we go. They're called red wigglers. They're also not an invasive worm because they live differently than the deep dwellers. I know there's been reports recently, and they're also into Ontario. There's an Asian jumping worm that they're also called Alabama jumping worm, but they're an introduced species, and they're starting to destroy the forest floor, which is not good. These are just containers that I hold composts and vermicasts. Everything we do here on our site is with vermicasts, it's like home movies. And this is what my daughter did when she was 6 months. And this is what she did when she was 6 months, 1 year old. I'm just kidding. My daughter will kill me if I said that. So we walk over here. I use wire mesh for my compost bins. I did use wood for a long time, but I find with the wire, I can move them around. They're easier to open, to harvest. As you can see, because of our planting beds and the way our garden is, we don't have a lot of space. So my harvesting has to be in a calculated manner. This is a compost that's ready to be harvested. I could make it smaller, I can make it larger, but it's having the circular pattern is really helpful. This is one that's being just added to right now. Just getting the temperature up. It's about 120 degrees. I wanted to get it to be about 140, keep it there for at least 3 or 4 days. Then what I'll do is once I've harvested the other one, I'll take this and put it in there and start this again. So I want to take the outside and put it there. So that's another form. Composting, we walk over here. We put the compost in the corner. Again, they're out of the way. Any way we can put our compost so that they're still part of the garden, but they also are tidy with the garden. When we moved into this house 25 years ago, there was nothing here except for the cherry tree in the center. The other thing I have is I have compost bins. I have 3 compost bins that are store-bought. So basically, these are called the Earth Machine. And then I have another one in the front of the house. They incorporate all our organic waste because in a garden, all our material, we want to reuse as best we can. So that's kind of, oh, I also wanted to show you this. This is camas. Right now here in southern BC, we have camas blooming. This was a major food source and trade good for the Coast Salish people on the coast. They would trade with the interior people because the interior people had a lot of protein, but not much starch. This was a wonderful starch. It's a root vegetable, as well as a beautiful flower. What else can I talk about? Again, small space. Just goes down here. This is for dahlia beds and for more planting areas. Again, the compost is reincorporated, everything is harvested and then put back into the gardens. So we try to make it cyclical in terms of what we can use. So I think I'm looking forward to people asking questions because I don't want to bore anybody.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, we've got a few more minutes. If there's anything else you want to show us, then we can open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, then just please add it to the chat, and I'll do my best to get them answered. But go ahead, David, and if there's anything else you want to show us or anything like.
Okay. One of the things is I do sell tomato starts in the spring. This is my tomato house. Everything here is fertilized with vermicasts. It's all organically done. The soilless mixes is a peat and coconut fiber base with perlite, no wetting agents. And then the vermicasts, as well as some kelp meal, are what is feeding these plants. And so for me, being able to produce something, harvest it, and then reuse it is just, I feel like it's quite well, for me, I'm sequestering carbon as well as I'm reusing what we do. And thus far, we haven't sent anything to the landfill except very invasive weeds. We have some pretty nasty weeds that are here. So Italicum or Arum Alitalica, Ranunculus repens, a number of a number of not so good guys. That horsetail, we don't have horsetail heel, but we can't compost it. My compost, I can't guarantee I would be able to kill the weed seeds or the roots, because my compost, although they get up to 140 degrees, I can't guarantee that the outside will heat up to kill the weed seeds. So that's kind of where that is. So quick and dirty.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions for you if you want to.
Yay!
I have many questions, but there's some from the chats here too. Let's see. Nate was asking, what green to brown ratio do you use, and how do you monitor the ratios when composting?
Good question. The ideal one is I'll go to all the books and I'll look at primarily 30-1. If you deal with maple leaves, I can get away with less, 25-1, 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. If it's oak leaves, then I'm going to even have more nitrogen to oak leaves. I have a chipper, so I don't really have to worry. I don't worry about that as much because I can incorporate them together, bring up the temperature and move them down, and then turn the pile over a period of time. So I can get away with not being really, really specific. It's a little bit different if you're composting in an apartment in a Rubbermaid container. Then you're doing more like 3-1, 3 parts paper to 1 part nitrogen. And then you have to monitor it to see if it's getting too wet or too dry. If it's too dry, then you can add some more greens to it, food scraps. If it's getting too wet, you add more organic material, more carbon, like leaves. One of the things I do is in the fall, I collect leaves. So I still have lots of leaves left from the fall to make sure, because at this time of year in Victoria, we're getting a lot of green material, a lot of grass material. So I need more carbon. I'm not getting as much carbon because most of the nice juicy stuff is coming up and it's perfect, but I need to get the more carbon into it so it can break down quicker. It will still break down, but then either the temperature will go too high, it will go above 160 and kill my beneficial microorganisms, or the temperature won't get high enough, so it becomes a static pile. And the static pile just means that it's doing its work, but it's a different group of bacteria. They're called the mesophilic bacteria or psychrophilic, very low level. It's not the thermophilic bacteria, which I'm trying to get working. And that's the heat bacteria type of thing. And I hope I answered your question in terms of, I know the ratios, but I'm more looking at, is it heating up? If it's heating up, then I know that I'm getting some balance. So what I'm doing more than that is monitoring the temperature. And that's how I'm looking at whether I have my ratios and my balances correct, and that I'm not producing any smells.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that I never realized that, that not all carbon sources are created equal, I guess. Like even the different leaves you monitor, like it's depending on what type of tree that is. So
yeah,
I think that's great. let me see, there's someone here too, it just says iPhone, I'm not sure. Says, do you recommend getting the red wiggler worms? They seem to be expensive. They're about 50 bucks,
Uh,
but not sure if they survive the winter. Do you have, hold on a sec, do you have a suggested supplier also?
uh, uh, n- I'll start with the last part first. No, I don't have a suggested supplier. When I first moved down here, I used to sell red wigglers, but what I found is the demand was so high, I depleted my populations. It took literally years to get the numbers up again. So
Wow.
I'm not big enough. Um, I am working with a fella on a project as a consultant where we're going to be trying to raise worms as to supplement an on a basically a land. We want to grow he wants to grow salmon, so we're going to use worms as part of the feed, and so we're looking
Okay.
at the volumes in tons uh, of material, and so we're just working out numbers and things of that sort right now. And he's about to embark upon trying to find where to buy the worms because he's going to look at massive numbers. There was a farm in southern BC that on the mainland that was selling worms, but I don't know if they're around. And they were doing both red wigglers and African blues. It's African blues. I never had success with those guys. The red wigglers is always what I've grown and used. They do very, very well. We don't get the same cold as Ontario or Alberta. Although it went
Yeah.
down to -12 this year, the worms were okay. I insulate my worm bins with cardboard or the wooden ones with styrofoam. And when it gets very cold, the worms go and ball together. And that's how they
Right.
maintain their kind of ambient temperature. Then when the temperature gets better, they move back out. So they're quite remarkable that way. Um, so I don't
Yeah.
have a supplier. They are very expensive, but if you get a manure pile or manure, often there's some red wigglers in there. It may take a matter of
Interesting.
months, but you can generate a population over time because in about 8 to 16 weeks, well, more like probably 3 months, they can be breeders. So you can grow your worms to be breeders, and then every cocoon egg sac they produce has 2 to 6 worms in it. And so in another 2 or 3 months, you can get another population. So if you're patient, you can build the populations up. The other part is they migrate. Sometimes you'll have a compost bin and suddenly you've got worms in there. Red wigglers are seeking food all the time because they live on the surface. Worms are classified in usually 3 different groups: surface dwellers, a little bit deeper dwellers, and then vertical burrow dwellers like the Lumbricus terrestris, the earthworm we think of. And but the composting worm is only at the surface, and they don't go very deep. So when they run out of food, they go to someplace else. It's quite interesting that way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Super, yeah, super cool. Yeah, it seems like this person's in Ottawa, so
Ah,
that's great. Yeah, so you'd have to take the cold into account there anyway. Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
I
I
I
had
had
a
my first.
question. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I had my first. I brought down my worms from the Yukon, and so they could take 10, 15 below quite easily, so long as I had an insulated bin. And I would monitor it because usually a bin will freeze from the outsides, but the inside may still be thawed. In the Yukon, when it would go down to 40 or 50 below, then I would have to move it in. But they stayed outside for long periods of time. I've also seen in-ground worm bins that are dug into the ground, lined with styrofoam, and then have another insulating sheet over the top and the sides as a way to prevent the freezing from going going really down. And if you have a snow layer, that's going to be another insulating factor with that.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. You just reminded me, actually, I had an experience where the heat went out in at a place I worked in during the winter time, and we came in the morning and they had one of the tower worm bins.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a pretty good layer of ice on the top. Or when we got there, we ran it up to the greenhouse, and it thawed out, and we may have lost a few worms, but it was relatively okay. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something to keep in mind too. Yeah. One question I had for you about harvesting. I'm wondering about your worm castings, and what do you find is the easiest way to harvest the castings without taking all the worms too?
Different ways of doing that. One, I've offered my daughters that I would pay them farm wages at 10 cents an hour, and they refused. I don't know where that came from, but hand sorting, I sift out all the vermicast and then separate the worms and the material that hasn't broken down. The other way you can do it is on a bright sunny day, put out a sheet of plastic or a tarp, put mounds of your material from your worm bin on the sheet, and because worms breathe through their skin, they can't take the heat. So they'll go down deeper, and then you slough off the top, and then they go down deeper, and then deeper. And we're not talking really deep, about maybe a foot at the most. And you keep on taking off the top, so the worms are migrating to the bottom. So after a couple hours or less, depending on the heat and the sun, the worms have moved to the bottom, and it saves you a lot of time from taking every single one out. And that's a pretty quick way of doing it as well.
Yeah, cool. Just taking advantage of their natural tendencies, I guess.
Exactly. Yes, very much so.
Yeah. Well, we're getting the last few minutes here, but Nate's got another question. It says, being a surface feeders, how does the red wiggler differ from the jumping worm? And have you heard of the hammerhead worm? Just heard about it today, and it's a new invasive worm here in the States, I guess. That's what he says.
Yes. There's where is it? The University of North Carolina puts on a worm conference every year. The person who organizes this is a woman named Rhonda Sherman, and she has looked at this, and red wigglers, because I should back up. Worms have a bad rap right now. They're killing the hardwood forest back east. There's what they do is, and it's the deep dwellers, or the jumping worm, or the hammerhead worm. What they're doing is they're eating all the detritus in the forest. As they eat the detritus, they're taking away the nutrition for the trees, but also for the microorganisms and the fungi that help feed the trees and that. So they leave their castings in that, but they've already eaten all the material, so there's not enough left for the forests. The composting worm only lives on the surface, and because they don't burrow into the soil, they're not taking all the material away. And what they do eat, they're leaving more deposits that can add to the soil. They also don't migrate as like what they're finding because as someone just pointed out, the jumping worm they've now found in Ontario. They found it last year, and now they're really they're being very conscious of where it's being found, because it was in central Ontario. And if it's in central Ontario, it's not a big jump to go into northern Ontario, because none of the worms we have are indigenous. They're all introduced. the glaciers, when they first came to Canada and the States, the northern part of the States, they took all, when they retreated, they scoured all the landmass off, so all the soil, and hence they took a lot of the worms. The only indigenous worms we have are on Vancouver Island. We have a Vancouveriensis, which is a very rare worm in the central part of the island under the Nitnat forest, in the forest of the Nitnat Lake areas, and it's an indigenous worm, and they're finding a few of them on these refugiums where the glaciers didn't come and scrape off the surface. They've even found some in the Yukon in some of the places where they haven't, where it wasn't glaciated, there were these little corridors. So it's a fascinating thing, but there's not a lot of money, and we don't know a lot about them because there's not the research. The cachet of saying, I'm researching worms isn't as great as saying something else. So the invasive species now, the other thing is the jumping worm and the hammerhead are out competing the other worms. So because of their activities and how they are, they're more vigorous, let's say. So
you just blew my mind with the glacier and the worms not being indigenous here. Well, we're getting, that's awesome. One last question here, changing topics from Norma. She said, she asked, what's your favorite tomato variety?
I have a couple. One is the Black Crims, lovely heirloom tomato. I love the Cherokee Purples. They're a fairly large one. I also like one, and it was developed by a guy here just on Thetis Island. It's called Adam Hunter's Best of All. He was an old fella, and I got to meet him, but I still have collect his seeds, and so I like his tomatoes. So there's some of my favorites.
Awesome.
There's also a brand new tomato varieties about to come on into Canada. They're sold through Victory Seeds. They're called dwarf tomatoes. And what they are is they act like a determinant. They only get to be 4 feet high, but they also act like an indeterminate because they produce fruit all season long. So the determinants only produce for up to 3 to 4 weeks. Right. Indeterminates can get really tall. These new tomatoes are, for me, it will give people in condos, on decks, and that more of an opportunity to share in the harvests. And so I'm pretty excited about that. Victory Seeds is where I have just now found getting their seeds from.
Excellent. Cool. Right on. Well, some great advice there. I'm going to check out some of those tomatoes for next year. Well, I think we're just about at time there now, but I want to thank you, David, for this has been great. Little hiccup at the beginning, and it worked out even better than it could have. So that's awesome. If just so everyone knows, next week's guest is Christina Nicolic. She's going to be talking about organic fertilizer options with the focus on slow release, full spectrum fertilizers such as kelp, frass, sea minerals, and perhaps also amendments like humic acid and biostimulants. So that's super important topic. So don't miss that one. And I'm also hosting that one, so hopefully it'll run smooth. And I'll have technical support as well. So yeah, once again, thank you, David, for taking the time and imparting all this information to us. And everyone else, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next week. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
I'll stop.
Thank you very much.